In the early 1990s, a friend of mine had a bootleg VHS tape of Dark Shadows, the legendary supernatural soap opera from America that had never been shown in the UK. So we sat down to watch it, and it was like this.
Don't you understand that Angelique will find a way of... This will make her destroy you more quickly.
I'm ready to do battle with Angelique.
Barnabas, forget the girl. Find Quentin.
These days it's incredibly easy to find Dark Shadows. A lot of it's on YouTube, and the episodes that aren't are on the kind of advertising-led streaming services that are hungry for content. Frankly, it's made for this world. There are 1,225 episodes of it, each one about 20 minutes long, and it combines horror, science fiction, fantasy, time travel, soap opera, all the kind of stuff that's in vogue these days, apart from reality TV. If you're into kitsch and the unintentionally funny, it's also right up your street, because it was made very cheaply, very fast, with no time for retakes, and there's a lot of mistakes in there.
I must get back to Conwood as quickly as possible. Whether it's right or wrong, I want to be with Sarah now, before anything happens.
I won't have an accurate copy of the passenger list until I hear from the terminal in that place in Brazil.
In America, it has a kind of legendary status that it doesn't have in the rest of the world because the boomer children who were growing up in the mid to late 60s were addicted to it. They'd run home from school to watch it in the afternoons. I mean, they would. It's a soap opera with monsters in it. In Europe, we were denied that thrill because the rest of the world just wasn't in the habit of showing 5-day-a-week US daytime soaps.
There's no telling what's going to happen, is there?
No. Not even the computers can figure that out yet.
If you were a genre fan like me, you'd sort of heard of it, partly because it was such a strange concept that word had spread. In my case, it was also because I used to hang around charity shops, thrift shops, collecting old books, and there was a series of Dark Shadows spin-off books that had made their way across the Atlantic. I didn't actually read them, so I was unaware that they were gothic romances aimed at women, but I did buy them very cheaply and look at the back covers, which told me about the small town of Collinsport and its resident bloodsucker, and his cousin, who was a werewolf. Also, the witch and the ghosts and all the other hokum. It sounded fantastic.
So on with the show, you'll love it, I know. Oh, I'm going to dance for you.
So let's talk about how it all started. In 1966, the producer, Dan Curtis, successfully pitched the idea of a gothic show to the ABC network. It's about a governess. She's actually a foundling who grew up in a children's home, who goes to work for a rich family on the coast of Maine and finds that everything's a bit strange and eerie and messed up. It has a touch of the Jane Eyres about it. There is a plotline involving a ghost at one point, but you'd be hard pressed to call this a show about the occult. For the first 200 or so episodes, it's mildly mysterious more than anything. Then came the fateful day when the network gave Curtis an ultimatum. They said, look, these ratings aren't very impressive. If you can't find a way to boost them, we're going to cancel the show. So, in desperation, he thought, all right, I'll introduce a vampire. That's when the series took off, when he devised the character of Barnabas Collins, a well-spoken man who claims to be a relative from England, but in truth is one of the undead. The conundrum these days is, do you watch from the very beginning and go through the early episodes with their leisurely pace, or do you pick things up at this point when Dark Shadows goes bonkers? As played by the Canadian actor Jonathan Frid, Barnabas is initially an out-and-out bad guy, as you'd expect. The plan was to kill him off, but he was instantly the most popular character in the series. So what do you do in a situation like that? Essentially, the producers had to find a way to make him the hero and the main character. I don't envy them that challenge, and I never found their solution entirely convincing, but this is what they did. Years before the novelist Anne Rice wrote Interview with the Vampire and made her protagonist guilt-stricken about having to kill people to survive, Dan Curtis did pretty much the same thing with Barnabas. This was groundbreaking. Audiences had grown up with Dracula and the like, and now you had this vampire with a conscience, a mopey, introspective vampire. Oh, I feel so bad about sinking my teeth into ladies of the night down by the docks. How can I ever live with myself?
You want me.
The other thing they try to do to humanise him, literally, is they bring in this character of Dr. Julia Hoffman, played by Grayson Hall. She's a blood specialist who attempts to cure him of his vampirism and secretly falls in love with him along the way. Now, all the actors in Dark Shadows are theatrical to some extent, but Grayson Hall takes the cake in this regard.
Barnabas.
What is it, Julia?
Barnabas, Carolyn has seen Gerard.
How do you know?
Because tonight she sang her song.
Curtis described the show as nickel and dime television at its best, and like I said, because it was made very cheaply and in a hurry, it has a lot of bloopers in it that were just left to stand. No one was going to watch this stuff 60 years later, were they?
Look for it.
The portrait is missing. How unfortunate.
There's a tremendous amount of back acting in it. I swear one actor talks to another actor's back, so they're both looking at the camera.
At the risk of sounding banal, it's a small world, isn't it?
It's too small for both of us, Nicholas.
And in one episode we even see Jonathan Frid going home in his everyday clothes during the closing credits. But set against all that is the show's incredible audacity and imagination. Once they'd introduced Barnabas Collins, they had to keep mining that seam of the fantastic. So before too long, the series goes back to 1795 to tell us his origin story. It stays there for months, and in a move that was revolutionary at the time, they didn't change the actors. It's the same people playing their ancestors or some other part. It's in 1795 that we're introduced to Angelique the Witch, played by the staggeringly beautiful Lara Parker.
I will be not sit here accepting this.
Angelique is Barnabas's lowly bit on the side, just as he's preparing to marry his beloved fiancée, Josette. He doesn't know that she's a witch, and he ditches her unceremoniously, and so she takes revenge in various evil ways, culminating in a curse, the curse of vampirism. When a grave robber inadvertently releases Barnabas from his chained-up coffin, he emerges into the swinging 60s, but he never stops pining over his fiancée, Josette, who just happens to look exactly like Maggie Evans, a waitress in 20th century Collinsport. From here on in, the show just gets weirder and weirder as it rips off the Frankenstein story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and whatever it can lay its hands on from the public domain. It also brings in the character of Quentin, the handsome werewolf, to give Jonathan Frid a bit of time off. When I watched these episodes on videotape in isolation in the 1990s, it looked like a lot of badly acted nonsense. But I was selling the series short. If you actually sit down and watch it on a streaming service, you become invested in the characters, and it's strangely compelling, not least because of its absolutely bizarre storylines. It's difficult as a non-American to appreciate just how popular it was, until it was cancelled in 1971, that is. There's a blog that I'd recommend called Dark Shadows Every Day that gives you an insight into this, with, for instance, reports of Jonathan Frid touring the country and being treated like one of the Beatles, or being invited to the White House for the birthday party of Richard Nixon's daughter. If you can cope with the homemade quality of classic Doctor Who, then I would recommend you at least try Dark Shadows. Both of these shows had extremely talented and ambitious people running them back in the day, meaning Dan Curtis and Doctor Who's first producer, Verity Lambert. Both introduced monsters that caught on with the public, namely the Daleks and Barnabas Collins. And both went overboard with chroma key, now known as green screen, when it was a novel and imperfect special effect. By the way, you know those charity shop books I talked about at the beginning? Well, you can get them on CD now. There's also a 1990s reboot with Ben Cross as Barnabas, which I haven't watched yet, and the 2012 Tim Burton film with Johnny Depp that a lot of Dark Shadows fans don't like. As a fairly casual observer, I quite enjoyed it, but it's not a patch on House of Dark Shadows, the spin-off movie from 1970 that retells the Barnabas Collins story from 1967, but lets him remain a classically evil vampire.
Good evening. I'm Barnabas Collins. If I didn't see you with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it.
Barnabas Collins, head of a family of blood relations.
So, YouTube viewers, what do you think of Dark Shadows? Are you an old school fan of it? Did you watch it once and think it was awful? Let me know in the comments. And if this kind of nonsense appeals to you, please smash that like button and subscribe.